Welcome to today's webinar, Food Waste at Retail, first of its kind data from the Pacific Coast Food Waste Commitment. We are really excited to have you joining us today. We've been waiting for this webinar for some time now. As you'll see throughout the course of the presentation, this is really the culmination of the work that ReFed, along with our partners at the Pacific Coast Food Waste Commitment, have been driving towards since this started back in 2019. For me, I think it really demonstrates the potential of pre-competitive collaborations like this, where businesses are working together to achieve really important sustainability goals that we're all facing. And what's most exciting is that it's really just the beginning. I think data collection and submission can feel like an endpoint, which is definitely a point to celebrate, but really it's just getting us started on the journey towards the important work of scaling up and implementing solutions to food waste. My name is Jackie Suggett. I'm Director of Capital Innovation and Engagement here at ReFed. For those of you who are not familiar with ReFed, we are a national nonprofit working to end food loss and waste across the U.S. food system by advancing data-driven solutions. One way that we do that is through events like this, where we try to bring that fight against food waste to life through the experiences and the expertise of a range of webinar panelists. And I'm really excited for the guests that will be joining later today, but you're stuck with me for a little bit first. ReFed also serves as a resource partner alongside World Wildlife Fund and WRAP for the Pacific Coast Food Waste Commitment, or the PCFWC. The PCFWC is an unprecedented, pre-competitive public-private partnership featuring some of the nation's largest food businesses alongside local, state, and provincial governments in the Pacific Coast region, all working collaboratively together towards our shared ambition of effective industry-wide actions to prevent wasted food along the West Coast. The voluntary agreement builds on existing food waste reduction platforms and commitments, including the UN Sustainable Development Goal 12.3 and our own Champions 2030 here in the US. It's also modeled after similar global agreements that you may have heard of, such as the Courtauld Commitment in the UK or the Pacto por la Comida in Mexico. And it's based on the Target Measure Act framework that's used around the world for food waste reduction initiatives. As mentioned, the PCFWC includes jurisdictions up and down the West Coast that are participating in this food waste reduction project. You can see those listed on your screen now, and I just want to say thank you for all of their participation and support and engagement on the project. I also mentioned that ReFed is a resource partner for this effort. Here are the others that are involved in this. We are working behind the scenes with our friends at Cascadia Policy Solutions, WRAP, and World Wildlife Fund, as well as a number of industry consultants who are managing specific components and projects of the PCFWC. And finally, in addition to the jurisdiction partners already mentioned and the resource partners, we have our signatories. We currently have 15 food business signatories in the PCFWC. Our initial focus has been in retail. We did want to be intentional in the early days of this program to focus our efforts and our design in a single sector to learn and grow from there. And we also recognized the central role that retailers play in the food system and the power that they have to partner with and engage their supply chain partners. We're really excited now to be recruiting signatories from additional sectors and for these efforts to expand. And you'll hear more in one of our later discussions in the webinar about how the PCFWC is building on the work that's already started in retail to engage some of these other sectors. But for today's webinar, we are going to focus on retail data. The driving force, I would say, behind the PCFWC is the belief that data collection is critical for anything that we're doing in food loss and waste. It's the really important middle of that Target Measure Act framework that I mentioned. The more we understand where, why, and how much waste is occurring, the more effective we can be in targeting and implementing the right solutions to address that waste. So last year, we released our first data set, which included unsold food rates, destinations, and impacts for our retailers from the year 2019. And then this spring, we recently released data from those same retailers for the years 2020 and 2021. So 3 total years of data. Why is this important? I think the PCFWC is actually the second food waste voluntary agreement in the world to have built a data set like this, and it's the first in the US. And for the first time, we're really able to see year over year real-time results that are aligned with international reporting standards so that we can really start to understand what's happening on the ground when it comes to food waste reduction initiatives. This information is not only beneficial to the PCFWC signatories to track their own progress and benchmark their own efforts against their peers, but can also be used by retailers who are not yet signatories to the PCFWC, both in the Pacific Coast region and beyond. And this data set has become a really integral part of ReFed's own data in the Insights engine that you may be familiar with. I'm going to spend a few minutes now walking through some of these key findings in the data, followed by some discussion about what this all means for our signatories and for the PCFWC more broadly. Given our relatively short amount of time, I'm really only going to be sharing a few of the top line trends coming out of that data. So I definitely encourage you to dive into our annual report to explore any of those findings further. With that, let's dive in. So let's start with unsold food rates and specifically with the graph on the left. So what you're seeing here are the unsold food rates, and we'll get to where all this unsold food is going in a minute. But unsold food includes all food that went unsold in each grocery store food department. Those are all rolled up here in this graph, but we'll look at department level here in a minute. This includes edible food and food scraps. And this metric is really one of the most important metrics for measuring and tracking food waste at retail because it's a direct measure of food waste prevention. So first, I want to explain kind of this reverse checkmark shape that you're seeing still on the graph on the left. We're working with a relatively small amount of data still as far as the year over year that we're covering with only 3 years. And our primary reporting years overlap with the COVID-19 pandemic. So we are making some assumptions of what happened based on our own research as well as conversation with retailers. But in 2020, in the early days of the pandemic, restaurants were closing, consumers were purchasing a lot more of their food at grocery stores. As we heard from PCFWC retailers, this increased demand, as well as the supply chain challenges that we were all facing, led many retailers to face insufficient supply and or rapid sell-through of food that made it to their stores, ultimately leading to less waste. We as consumers saw a portion of this as well. If you remember going into the grocery store during this time, sometimes we are finding empty shelves because of those challenges. In 2021, as supply chains started to normalize a bit, unsold food rates increased, but still showing a net decrease from 2019. Now, if we shift to the graph to the right, you'll notice a different shape here. This is looking at the actual tons of unsold food. So although unsold food rates increased from 2020 to 2021, absolute tons of unsold food have decreased since 2019. It's really important to remember when looking at this graph that there are several factors that impact the volume of food that's in a supply chain. Things like population growth, demand for food, even business performance. So although the unsold food surplus rate increased, the total tons of surplus food can still decrease. And in fact, sales data from Nielsen from these years indicates that total food handled by regional grocery stores declined from 2020 to 2021. So that decline was apparently enough to counteract the increase in the unsold food rate. Now let's look at where that's happening across departments. So this view is really important to us at the PCFWC because this in part is how we identify hotspots and areas to focus our work. So we see that these unsold food rates were highest in the prepared foods and the bread and bakery departments in 2019, and they remain the leading categories by rate in 2020. High unsold food rates in these departments in particular could be due to the fact that, first of all, these are products that are highly perishable, especially when on display, and because customer demand for fresh, made on site, ready to eat items was high and increased during COVID-19. I think a lot of us lost some of those traditional restaurant outlets and probably realized how much we don't enjoy cooking from scratch every day. And so those types of products were something we were looking for. And even in the best of times, predicting customer demand for these can be really challenging. And so that difficulty definitely increases with changes in consumer behavior and supply chain challenges that we've seen over the last 2 years. As I mentioned, within the PCFWC, we look at this metric that you're seeing on the screen. We also look at the retail value, and we look at the GHG emissions by department. Those aren't visualized in this deck, but you can see some of that data in the annual report. And we all together collectively look at that to help prioritize where we want to focus our intervention pilots and our efforts, which we'll talk a little bit more about with Tara later in the webinar today. Now let's look at where that food is going. So please note, when we talk about unsold food, this does include donations. So you will see that as a destination here on this chart. And I'm first going to focus on the unknown destination on the far right, as I imagine that is bringing some questions. So when we measure food loss and waste at retail, we're actually using two different methodologies to do so. The first is measuring what comes in the door and what goes out the door and figuring out the difference between those two. The second is to add up all the volume of where we can see that food going, which are the destinations you see here on the chart. In a perfect world, those two methodologies should yield the same number. We are far from a perfect world, and so they never do. And the difference between those two is your unknown. So what that means is that we can quantify that there's unsold food by looking at the difference between that and the out the door methodology, but we can't figure out where that food is going based on the known data that we have. This is a really important metric, I think, just to have included, so we have that total visibility of what's happening. As you can see here, we see that unknown rate going down, and this is great news. This is suggesting that the reporting retailers are improving their measurement accuracy and gaining higher visibility to where that unsold food is going. It is important to note, in line with that a decrease in the unknown destination doesn't necessarily mean less waste there, as much as a reallocation of that unsold food. So when we see other destinations increase over time, such as landfill or even donations that you see here, some of that is very likely attributable to a reallocation from the unknown. So it's not necessarily that retailers are sending more food to landfill in this case, for example, but actually gaining better visibility to what was always going to landfill. Finally, let's get a quick overview of the impacts. So the column on the left here is quantifying impacts from our most recent year of data collection, so 2021. The column on the right is showing trends since we started measuring in 2019. When reviewing these numbers, please note, as it says on the left here, that these are assuming that the reporting retailers are representative of the PCFWC US region as a whole. So these are regional impact number estimates. Overall, we're seeing the impacts trend in the right direction: an increase in meals donated, a decrease in CO2 emissions and water usage, with lost sales staying more or less the same over time. And you can see more information about the dollar value of unsold food over these years in the annual report. So with that, I'm going to pause quickly and just see if any questions have come in on the chat about the data. I see one. Could you share a bit about the reasoning behind including food scraps in these rates? That's a good question. That actually stems from REFED's methodology as a whole, which is kind of the underlying methodology that we're using for this. I think because we're looking at some of these recycling-based destinations, such as composting, anaerobic digestion that take scraps, we want to include those as an input if we're going to measure them as an output. I think that's the only question. Oh, let me check the chat again. Carbon footprint, these are upstream and downstream emissions. Actually, if our data team's on, they can confirm that, because I tend to mix up my data sources sometimes here, but those should be upstream and downstream emissions. The how. Okay, I'm actually going to touch on the how a little bit later, so I'm going to ask a hold on the question about how we got to these numbers. All right. With that, let's go back to the slides here. Great. So before I introduce my guests, I just want to quickly touch on what's next for the PCFWC and data collection. So we're really excited to continue collecting and reporting on retail data using this framework. And it's important to note that the collection of the 2020 and 2021 data went a lot quicker than it did in 2019. So I think hopefully that's meaning the retailers are becoming more comfortable with this process, and that's something that we can be expanding and scaling over time. And we'll obviously continue to look for process improvements along the way. We've also started to develop a reporting process that mirrors this for hospitality, food service, and manufacturing sectors. So we began piloting that in 2022. We're actively piloting that still this year in the hopes of being able to replicate a lot of this in those sectors going forward. And you can access all of this data on the Pacific Coast Collaborative website, and we'll put a link for that in the chat right now. I see a lot more data questions coming in too. I am going to go ahead and push us into our conversations with Chris and Tara. And if we have time at the end, I'll make sure to circle back and address some of those questions. All right, so here to dig into what this data means for retailers, I'm really happy to be joined by Chris Franke, who's on the global sustainability team at Walmart, which is one of our retail signatories. Chris, really great to have you here today.
Great to be here as well. Thank you.
Let's maybe kind of back out from the data even a little bit just to start. And I'd love to hear how your engagement with the PCFWC has affected how Walmart views food loss and waste as a programmatic priority internally.
Absolutely. Yeah. So I'm happy to be excited on this call. I think really from Walmart's perspective, our journey kind of started really years before the engagement with the PCFWC in terms of tackling zero waste holistically. Following kind of Hurricane Katrina, we realized sort of we could leverage our scale for the greater good and set a couple of initial sustainability goals. One of those centered around achieving zero waste. Fast forward a few years, so we kind of set our food loss and waste baseline in 2016 and had been tracking sort of this internally since then. So back in 2021, I think for COP26, we got this request saying, hey, why don't you all join this Pacific Coast food waste commitment? And, at the time, it's sort of like, well, one more reporting requirement, one more coalition, one more work group. But this one had some differences to it. So Walmart had already been actively engaged with the Consumer Goods Forum on the global stage as part of a food waste coalition of action, already joined with WRI and Champions 12-3 initiatives, 10 by 20 by 30, which you all may be familiar with. But this kind of took the same goal and put it in a very localized US-centric regional scale, kind of a commitment with teeth, as we were kind of joking about the other day. So while it did have some additional reporting requirements, it sort of gives us the ability to take kind of this pre-competitive nature, if you will, and apply it more locally so that we can achieve, some of the report might suggest we've kind of got a majority of the market share out in the Pacific Coast region through the retail signatories that are participating. That gives us basically the opportunity to tackle universal issues, things like food packaging and extending shelf life on perishables, finding kind of common denominators in high food waste items. So it's got a lot of very strategic benefits to us as with our operating model and how we execute our strategy.
That's great, Chris. And in your comments, you kind of mentioned the first reaction that I'm sure many have, which is like one more commitment, one more reporting process, which is a reality. And I think something we've acknowledged and tried to simplify, which someone asked about the how we do reporting. We can address that a little bit later, maybe talk about that. But talk to me more about the data. We know it's not easy. I think we often hear, hey, retailers, just report, right? Just submit the data. That's definitely not the reality of the job that you have to do every day. So what was the data collection process like for Walmart?
Fun, very sarcastically speaking, but no, really, I mean, it's, you'll hear it time and time again if you come to enough of these presentations that you don't know what you don't measure or what you don't see. Walmart operates more than 10,000 stores and clubs in 20 different countries around the world. We have a very omni-channel footprint from e-commerce, online shopping. You kind of layer in our supply chain, manufacturing operations, any support facilities, language barriers, you name it. There's a number of impediments that basically come along with adding one more reporting ask. So at first, just like everything else, it's difficult, but you kind of start with what you know, the data that's readily available, establish a baseline, set those kind of early targets. The UN SDG 12.3 has a nice, easy goal to kind of align with. It's harmonized reporting templates and things like that have come out. Refed has some great insights. It's kind of, if you don't have that full comfort level in your own database, Insights Engine, retail calculators, a number of other things out there on the market to kind of help you quantify that. But as Jackie mentioned earlier, this is really only the second database in the world like this. So, again, if we don't know what the size of the problem is, we have a very hard time sort of tackling solutions to it. So you kind of deal with the grunt work, the groans and moans and learning curve, if you will. With this particular commitment, there was kind of an added layer that there was a few new data points that we weren't already tracking. Again, as I noted, we had been reporting food loss and waste for internal purposes back since our baseline in 2016, but tracked it a very different manner than some of our kind of more fringe data points, things like supplier rejection rates and percent of unsold food by category, and some of these other data points that we have readily available but weren't currently included in the process. And then, of course, as you can imagine, asking Walmart to share data of any kind has its own inherent challenges. You've got to involve legal and comms and all the fun stakeholders to really kind of present this as a business case, to justify the means for sharing this data for the greater good. And so we really felt that this kind of covered that for a lot of reasons. After you kind of get over that initial hump, like Jackie noted, the last year's reporting was much more seamless, much easier. Just kind of getting out there and scoping out what data sets are available within your own organization, piecing those together, building out that framework allows you to kind of start making this business as usual, integrating it in your annual reporting requirements. And then that's when the fun really starts, and you can start actually taking a step back and looking at that data. So.
Yeah, I want to get to that fun here in a second, but maybe one follow-up for you, Chris, I think is, in addition to the grunt work that you mentioned, there's probably also an internal sales process to this, right? And you might be a little bit of an exception here, but I think a lot of times when we work with food businesses, the point of contact for this is not the person who pulls the data. And so I'm curious what that internal process looks like and how you have to get that buy-in.
Absolutely. I think on the retail side of the house, everything's kind of point of sale. So, every store, retail outlet has an internal database where the vast majority of this information is housed. Now, that's not to say it's a perfect system either. There's certainly lots of, inherent gaps, depending on how you're looking at the data, whether you're accurately tracking like scan out codes, all kinds of other things, looking at weight conversions, et cetera, of produce, bulk product, dry grocery, all the fun things. But anywhere you can, I think, to kind of leverage, I think for us, I sit on our sustainability team. So I'm in charge of leading our trajectory on our strategic goals at a high level. But the win at the end of the day is really getting this embedded in the business, making kind of regeneration, sustainability part of the daily tasking within the associate's job function. So when it gets to the point where you leverage the systems and the framework that you already have, and just make sure that the sustainability data points that you need are embedded in there, it becomes commonplace and pretty easy after that.
Great. Thanks for that insight. I want to go back to the fun part now, hopefully. Since you are now 3 years of reporting in, so I hope I can assume and say that it's worth it. So would love to hear, looking forward, how will you use this information to address food waste within your operations, and where is there value in this for you now that you have access not only to your own data in many ways, but also the benchmarking that comes from a pre-competitive partnership?
I would say there's certainly quite a bit of value add to this, starting with the pre-competitive nature. We know our own operations, we know what our own data looks like, but you can't just kind of go to a competing retailer and ask them what to share their food loss and waste numbers. And so leveraging something like the PCFWC enables really all of us to kind of peel back the curtain just enough so that we kind of have an idea of where the issues are, really across the full value chain, end to end, as we like to say. So, you saw the charts up there, kind of which departments or which categories of food we might have high waste, things like prepared foods, produce, et cetera. These are universal things that are plaguing all grocery retailers. It's not anything specific or magical to Walmart, but we might have some best practices that we can share with one another without kind of disclosing specifically where those came from. So the first piece of that is just finding kind of common solutions to universal problems, leveraging the pre-competitive nature with Pacific Coast. That's been huge. I'll say like leveraging also the partnership with an entity like Refed that owns this insights engine and this massive database of full of gobs of information that you can sort of dovetail our operational food loss and waste information into, layer into, gives us the ability to kind of have these custom roadmaps where you then take sort of where your data exists in its current state, pile on the cost of certain food loss and waste interventions, what that benefit might look like in terms of avoided emissions, but also cost to implement. That piece of information is not something that we would have without sharing a little bit of our data. Also kind of speaking in terms of like offering up that, pulling back the curtain a little bit, if you will, a lot of this data is hinged on financial information that businesses, are not always willing to just kind of blanketly share. So, but you put things in terms of like weight and pounds, like a universal data attribute when we're talking about food waste. We're not necessarily getting into dollar signs and things like that. That data is being shared. It's percentages and weight, mass, et cetera, stuff that we can all kind of speak to in universal fashion. So hoping to get a lot of insights out of that. We've already kind of started engaging on one particular project, looking at key waste products and trying to find solutions really end to end. So that's been abundantly critical to kind of give Walmart a benchmark to say, this is sort of how you would go about it for any number of food products. And so we can kind of take that, piggyback on it, move on to next products and things like that, and actually shape tangible solutions and actionable game plans and things like that will hopefully drive our reduction initiatives towards our 2030 goal.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for sharing, Chris. And I think you're bringing in kind of that data to action translation is a really good transition to our next conversation here. So a big thank you to Chris. He is going to be back for Q&A. So I'm just going to ask him to hang tight here for a few minutes. In the meantime, I'm also joined by Tara McNerney from the World Wildlife Fund, who is one of the resource partners for the PCFWC. Tara specifically works really closely with all our food business signatories on intervention projects, which are basically our pilot projects that we do. And so she speaks a lot with the food businesses that are part of this partnership and helps support in their food waste efforts. So Tara, thanks for joining today.
Yeah, hi. Thank you.
Similar kind of with Chris, I want to maybe back out a little bit first and think about you're having these conversations with all signatories of the PCFWC about how the pre-competitive nature can support their efforts. And I would love to just hear from you about the benefits and challenges of public-private partnerships and pre-competitive partnerships and the importance of data that you're hearing in your conversations.
Yeah, thank you. And by the way, so many great questions in the Q&A. That'll be really interesting to dive into those insightful questions. But so a lot of challenges and a lot of benefits, as Chris was saying. I'm glad he went first so he could really provide testimonials to that. But what we are hearing is that businesses really find a big benefit in being able to talk pre-competitively with one another and just share common challenges and successes. We've seen a lot of our pilot projects that took off really in 2020 and 2021, then gain a lot of traction and interest from other signatories and other businesses wanting to repeat those solutions that were uncovered in the pilot projects. And then there's just this general sense too of that through the working groups and being connected with WWF and Refed, businesses feel more plugged in to upcoming solutions around food waste, the broader discussion, regulations that could be coming down the pipeline or already are. So there's just kind of a general benefit to being, part of the main stage food waste discussion there. And then finally, just with the data in particular, businesses share that the process of collecting the data and getting everyone on their teams involved in gathering that data really sparks conversation. And leadership, when they see the data, it's so tangible, right, that it really spurs action, not just at leadership, but really data can be used all along at every staffing level to inspire action. You know, we have an example of one retailer who uses data at even the store level to provide store managers feedback on how they're doing with their waste and diversion. And that really generates a lot of momentum and a culture around food waste reduction.
That's great. Thanks for giving us a bit of a pulse there, Tara. And as maybe some context for this next question, we've looked at the data. There are actually kind of three different ways that we use the data that we collect from food businesses in the PCFWC. The first is what we've just talked about, which is public reporting, right? You all just saw the numbers anonymized and aggregated that we are sharing on a year-over-year basis. The second way is to inform our intervention projects, which I alluded to earlier, the hotspot identification and prioritizing what we do. And the third is to provide direct value back to the food businesses with some of those really detailed metrics and benchmarking that we're able to do. So Tara, maybe the question is, how is this data being used kind of for those second two in particular? So providing value back to businesses, and then in a minute here, we can talk more about intervention projects as well.
Yeah, so I think, you know, as I was mentioning, the data helps really inform businesses, and as Chris was saying too, on their specific hotspots and areas that they could target to receive maximal benefit from addressing those areas. I think probably you'll talk more about custom roadmaps, Jackie, and I know Chris mentioned it as well, but those will be great tools as well moving forward for us to connect the data to action. We use the insights engine, the Refed insights engine, and this data set that we're presenting on today all the time for when we are advising businesses around ways to really focus and hone your efforts on food waste, for designing the intervention projects as well, because we want to make sure, you know, everyone's time and focus is limited. And so let's focus on the biggest, hardest hitting areas.
Yeah, so let's dive into those intervention projects a little bit. Would love to hear, maybe if you can just walk us through, how do we get there, right? How do we go from day one to an identified intervention project that we decide to execute? And then can you share some of the results that we're seeing with those?
Yeah, absolutely. So we first convene our businesses and signatories all together through working groups, which we currently have 3 working groups around dairy, produce, and food recovery. And we also have these things we call sector summits, in which we bring together signatories from the same sector. So say all retailers, all food service, all manufacturers together to talk to one another about their similar sector challenges. And it's in these meetings that we really get businesses talking to one another about common pain points or areas of interest. And that's where we start the design of the intervention projects, coupled with what the data is saying are the greatest areas of need for focusing on in food waste. And so then we really encourage this whole chain approach now focus to our intervention projects, which Chris kind of mentioned, which is where we're not just looking at, you know, one business in their silo, but we're asking them to think upstream. So if it's a retailer, upstream to the farm, the manufacturer, distributor, what are the things that they're doing in their store that's going to influence food waste upstream and downstream? Because we know from the Refed food waste insights engine that so much of our food waste is both on-farm food loss and household waste. So retailers, especially as this important, really important nexus point between those two ends of the food chain, have a lot of power to influence food waste, both upstream and downstream.
Yeah, and Tara, I'm looping in a question here that I just saw in the Q&A since we're on the topic already, but for those people who aren't as close to the PCFWC, can you maybe just share a couple examples of the pilots we ran last year and what some of the results were of those and how those hopefully are influencing retailers going forward? Or we've worked outside retail as well, I know, so feel free to share maybe just a couple examples.
Yeah, sure. So some of the different examples, and I would really encourage everyone, we can drop the link in the chat to our PCFWC landing page that has the current most up-to-date case studies published on them. But some include working on artificial intelligence and different inventory management systems and their impact on reducing food waste. And I believe it was an average of 15% shrink reduction as a result of using those. And the retailers who participated reported later after the pilot that they were planning to scan out widely to thousands of stores. So clearly benefits there that they're looking to expand on. We also have done some pilot projects with retailers in the field of upcycling. There's a lot of innovation going on around upcycling and taking near end of life produce or different food items and turning them into something new, especially in the retail prepared foods section, which has been an area of high interest for retailers lately in terms of profit recouping. And then we've also done a pilot project focused around staff engagement, really gamifying food waste and getting staff involved at every level. This was a pilot that we did in particular with a manufacturer local to where I am in Portland, Oregon, Bob's Red Mill, and they really engaged their employees in submitting ideas on potential food waste reduction efforts that could be done. And then creating really, I think we gathered around 170 ideas from employees by the end of it, and then chose one to implement as part of the pilot. And that was really important for building a culture of sustainability and demonstrating to leadership the potential of harnessing that whole group power. And that pilot is now being looked at being repeated by several other manufacturers in the PCFWC as well. So
Great.
Good ideas are catching, it turns out.
That's the end goal, right? As they expand and scale. One last question, and then we are going to open up to audience Q&A. I see a ton of questions coming in, but please keep them coming and we'll get to as many as we can. But Tara, just take us to the next few years. What do you think the next few years hold for the PCFWC, and what is the role of this data collection process that we've built in bringing that future?
Yeah, the next few years are going to be really exciting. I think we're just going to see exponential progress as we bring more businesses on. We increase our market share that the PCFWC is growing. Public awareness about food waste is really growing as well, and so driving demand there. The long effects of COVID are lessening on the sector as well, opening businesses up to being able to pilot new things and really partnering with one another. So I think we're going to see just, the data coming in and hoping to see a lot of progress around our goal to 50% by 2030. I think, and very specifically, some actions that we're excited to take for the PCFWC are really connecting these custom roadmaps, these mapping of retailer data to specific solutions for their particular business is going to be a really crucial tool that we can use to both provide them greater technical assistance to design our intervention projects and focus the efforts of our working groups. So I'm looking forward to using that tool more. And then, we're doing a lot of work with retailers at the corporate level, and it'll be exciting to help figure out how do we ensure that that's all coming down to the store-wide level. So how do we communicate this data basically at every level of the store so that we get full engagement and really see progress take off and spread?
Awesome. Well, a few exciting years ahead of us indeed. Thank you so much, Tara, for joining. I'm going to welcome Chris back on as well as we transition into some Q&A for the last portion of the webinar. I'm going to do my best to kind of get through as many of these as I can and may kind of pull some themes out for us to talk about a little bit to try and address some as well. Let me pull this up here. All right, let's see where to start. I did see, and I saw this answered in the chat already, but just to make sure people see it kind of high level, this reporting, the data was for the Pacific Coast states of the US. So California, Washington, and Oregon was the scope of the reporting in the data that we showed on the screen and the ANA report that you can find online. I maybe want to start with the first question, because there are several in here about the process for collecting this data, as well as a question around how that in the door and out the door was calculated. So let me kind of explain the process on our side, and then Chris, if you want to add anything as you hear that, please do. But I think when we started this journey, as was already referenced, we recognized that we're going to companies that are already having to report other places. We are not the first ones. We're also not asking for exactly the same thing. It was important for us to be able to have data that could inform solutions, which is a slightly different data set than a data set that's focused only on publicly reporting. So that was one challenge. The other challenge is this data is hard to get. The way that we report the data in the slides in a presentation like this is not the way the data lives inside a company. I see Chris smiling and probably could agree that it's not quite as easy as a copy and paste. So the process that we ended up using was a calculator template approach. So basically we have the template that we want at the end of the day, which is percentages and things that are shareable outside of a company's four walls. But we recognize that using things like point of sale data and financial data is actually the easiest way to get there. So what a calculator allows us to do is it allows companies to use really sensitive or confidential information like sales data and input that into a calculator that auto-populates a template that is shareable and is not confidential and is less sensitive. So that's the general approach we use. That's how the in the door, out the door is calculated, is we're actually asking for sales and for purchase data. We never see that as refed, but that's how we get there, is by using that information. So hopefully it allows for greater accuracy because we can access that more secure data without actually ever needing it to be reported. So that's the general approach we've taken. The other benefit of a calculator approach is we can auto-populate any template we want. It doesn't just have to be refeds. So we can look at who else is asking for similar data that can be estimated or measured from our data inputs, and we can auto-populate those. So for example, to Champions 2030, the WRI Atlas tool, those are all templates that we can link to our calculator and hopefully simplify for Chris and his peers and other companies the number of times they need to be filling out a template. Chris, anything you'd add just process-wise?
No, I was just going to add same thing on kind of the in the door, out the door kind of data collection. Really, I guess it's whenever you don't have accurate weights or you have to rely on estimations. I mean, that's where this kind of conversion and what we call value density, taking dollars and converting it to pounds. So Refed has a great calculator that's, by different produce departments or something like that, for example, where you input, say, your sales or your loss in terms of financials, and it outputs an average weight of, these food products by category to give you that weight where you need to rely on assumptions and estimations. There's a whole lot of other, nuanced things that kind of go on behind the scenes that I'd just encourage you to work with your finance teams specifically to kind of understand the back end adjustments and corrections and everything else. But again, that first step is just sort of getting out there and establishing a baseline with what you feel confident in, what you know. But yeah, that's more or less it.
And you started answering this next question a little bit already, so maybe back to you, Chris, to fill it in. But there are a couple of questions in here, I think, basically asking, you acknowledge the challenge of not only collecting the data, but getting the approval to share the data. Questions about, what about people that are, or companies that are just starting, maybe, guidance you have about overcoming some of those internal barriers, maybe a little bit more about what some of those barriers were that you did or didn't expect that could be helpful for others.
Yeah, I mean, really especially with food. So we like to conduct zero waste audits and things like that. So we'll go and have our trash compactor dumped in a landfill and suit up in Tyvek and go see what's in there. And, I would invite you all to go within your respective organizations, just, dumpster dive, essentially, see what's being thrown out. And when you talk food, it's got a really easy business connection on the financials specifically. As a grocery retailer, that's food that did not get sold, which is sort of our core function. So unsold food for us is sort of a negative on the business holistically. So it makes it really easy to kind of communicate to leadership. If you can put that loss in terms of dollars as a starting point and say, hey, this is how much food went unsold last year or last month or last week or in this store, and take that kind of to the next level, it opens up those pathways to basically try to find solutions for it. And you might not be seeking a sustainability food loss and waste reduction strategy, might be coming from a financial lens where you're trying to reduce your overall loss in a certain category or product. That enables you to bring in like merchant teams and your suppliers and things like that, kind of collectively work on figuring out where that loss is happening and then what you want to do about it. And then the inherent benefit is that you've got all these great environmental, add-ons value to that. So by reducing loss financially, you're doing something to reduce your food loss and waste for a sustainability goal, for example. So that's kind of putting the message in the audience, knowing your audience and communicating those KPIs and the ask to the respective stakeholders and speak that they understand is my go-to recommendation on that.
Thanks, Chris. Tara, one for you, and then this may kind of segue. There are several just questions on the data from earlier that we didn't get to talk to that I can speak to a few, but in sharing the examples of the case studies, you also mentioned data, right? That's another data input form for us, is these pilots are bringing that data in. Can you speak a little bit to just how those pilots are run from the data collection standpoint and how we view that data in conjunction with the total data that we're getting from food businesses?
Yeah, so as part of the pilot projects, we always have a baselining period and then a data collection during the implementation as well. And then follow up with a reflection on, okay, what is the data showing us as a result of the implementation? What were the externalities? Could this be repeated in alternative sectors or, additional stores? What would it mean for then scaling up? Does it create the business case? We're always looking at the business case for scaling this solution more broadly. And so that's always really helpful for us. And I know that ReFed likes to then take the data from these pilot projects and incorporate it into what the insights engine is able to provide. And so it's really kind of a circular loop of the intervention projects are being informed by the data from ReFed, but then the projects that and the data coming out of those are also going right back into the insights engine just to make it an even better tool for those using it in the future.
Awesome. Thank you, Tara. And let me maybe build on that. I'm going to address a couple of these questions that are coming through about the data. One was around the unknowns, and do we actually have any ideas about what those unknown amounts are? I would love to have ideas about what those are. I think by definition, unfortunately, we don't. We do have some hypotheses, I think, just because of conversations that we've had or just individual business data that we've seen in the way they measure it. I think one theme is that methodologies vary a little bit, especially in measuring landfill. And so, in the universe of food businesses reporting to ReFed, some are discounting that landfill number because it is an estimate of total organics or total materials going to landfill, which could mean some of that is showing up as an unknown. There are also sometimes challenges in getting accurate measurement from waste hauler partners, donation partners, animal feed partners, you name it. Anytime you're relying on the invoicing, that the reliability or the conversion of that can maybe also be contributing some of that into the unknown. There is, of course, like theft is going to show up there because that's not a destination that we're accounting for. So there will always be something there. I mean, we'll never get it perfect, but it probably is spread out across several of our destinations. We had another one in here about, I think it's because Chris mentioned the supplier rejection rates, about what happens, how do we think about food that is being sent back to suppliers? So we do ask for that because we don't define that actually as retail waste. So when we look at the total amount of food coming in the door, we want to make sure that we're subtracting that out essentially. And in our models at ReFed, that would go back to the manufacturing sector. So we ask for the data not to add it in, but rather to subtract it out and then account for where it's going from there when we go to measure the manufacturing waste. So with the data we're getting from retailers, we can't tell you where those supplier rejections are going, but in the data that we get from manufacturers, the goal is to then understand what happens to that when it gets back into their hands. Let me see if there's any more data focused ones here. There is a question about, are we going to be looking at restaurants as well? Yes, I think, as I mentioned before, we really did want to start in one sector and acknowledge we were not going to get it right the first time. So let's go through those growing pains and really get the process in place. Now that we've done 3 years of successful reporting, we are in pilot mode with that same calculator template model in manufacturing and in food service. And we'll continue to look to expand from there. It also, because this is really channeling through the PCFWC, we're also leveraging what partners we have as signatories within the PCFWC and what sectors they're coming from to help us pilot and test those. I think that's the majority of the data ones. I'll come back and look here in a second, but let me go back to Chris and Tara for a minute. We've got just a couple more minutes for questions. Let's look, Chris, maybe starting with you. Some examples of ways that retailers work with, partner with, influence up and down the supply chain. What does that look like in some of your food waste programming?
Yeah, absolutely. I think like we sort of serve at this nexus as Walmart or any retailer for that matter, where you're between kind of an intermediary between your suppliers, your growers, your farmers, et cetera, and then downstream with the consumer. So we play a very interesting role in kind of getting to see both ends of the spectrum, really. With the Pacific Coast collaboration, we have a wide mix of retailers, manufacturers, suppliers, et cetera, industry partners, consultants, you name it. So it allows us to kind of have these like pre-competitive partnerships with some of these supplier entities and things like that. Really upstream, as we're talking about working with our suppliers, I mentioned 10 by 20 by 30 earlier. I think that to me is like the kind of the key example that comes to mind in terms of a collaboration where you take 10 of the world's largest retail manufacturing entities, each collectively partnering with 20 plus key food suppliers to collectively work on these 2030 food loss and waste reduction goals. So we have Project Gigaton within Walmart as well, kind of opens up these pathways for discussions with our suppliers up and down the value chain to work and ensure that, when we have some kind of a best practice internal to Walmart, we're able to share that with our suppliers. Like, here's how you report food loss and waste, help kind of shape some of the tools and best practices along the way through partnerships like the Pacific Coast Collaborative. So upstream, that's kind of where we get to work on. One of the projects that we've kind of got underway right now is a great example of that. We hope to have some details later this year, but lots of really cool things going on that one to kind of look at a food product really end to end and see kind of what's going on. Downstream with our consumers, there's a lot of things we can do, from working with suppliers again to provide kind of on-pack branding, nudges for how to reduce food loss and waste in your home, selling right size portions and things like that in store, consumer campaigns, like international food loss and waste days and things like that, that we can kind of work as a retail to help amplify in store and through our .com channels, et cetera. But providing kind of simple messaging as well, maybe putting food that's like near expiry, kind of collectively discounting that to try to clear it off the shelves, but simultaneously nudging the fact that, the food is like peak freshness, et cetera, and amplifying it for use in a recipe or something like that. So lots of really good examples really on both ends that we can tackle. Thanks,
Chris, for mapping that out for us. We are getting into the final minutes here. I see a lot of questions still coming in, so I encourage you. We have provided and will provide contact information at the end of this. More than happy to follow up and answer the questions we didn't get to. But Tara, this feels like a good maybe question to end on here, which is just how can other food businesses or other players in the food system interact with the PCFWC if they aren't already?
Yeah, we are always hoping to grow our numbers because, the bigger we can be, the more impact we can have on the whole food supply chain, and partnered with one another and just really engage the whole value chain in collaborative action. So if you're interested, even, if you're doesn't mean you have to become a signatory, as soon as you reach out. We'd love to start just talking with you about, your own operations or your own goals around food waste. If you're not a company yourself, but are, a solution provider, we're always trying to keep tabs on, all the different actors at play here. And so I would really encourage you to reach out to me, and there might be opportunities to join our working groups if appropriate, or intervention projects down the line. So please, yeah, I think we'll be sharing our emails at the end. Reach out and yeah, looking forward to hearing from you.
Perfect. Thanks, Tara. Maybe throw your email in the chat there for people if they want to. Oh, Jeff already beat you to it. He's quick. Great. Well, that's all we have time for with the Q&A today. As I mentioned, please do continue to send questions through. More than happy myself or to connect you to Chris and Tara to answer those questions. I want to thank both of you for joining us and spending some time and sharing so many thoughtful insights. And also thanks to all those who joined the webinar today. We're really excited to share this data with you. We hope that you'll dive into it further and keep asking those questions, because that's how we ultimately get to solutions. As we said earlier, you can access all this data on the Pacific Coast Food Waste Commitment website. That URL is on the screen. It's also been shared in the chat a few times today. All of our case studies are there in addition to the annual report. So a lot of great data and information. As Tara mentioned, the PCFWC has hosted a whole series of intervention projects where we work with food businesses on piloting these operational changes. So that's where those case studies come in from. As always, we welcome any comments or feedback you'd like to share. You can do that via the email address that's on the screen now. That's also where you can send any additional questions. If you're not already connected to the PCFWC on LinkedIn and Twitter, please do. We share a lot of content and updates there, including some new case studies that are going to be released this summer. And I think that's a wrap for today. So thank you everyone for joining and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you so much.